I never thought I'd be the one telling this story. But after everything that's happened, after all the sleepless nights and the weight of what I know pressing down on my chest like a stone, I realize someone has to speak up. Someone has to break the silence that's been protecting a monster hiding in plain sight. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and I've been working missing persons cases for 12 years. I've seen families torn apart, hope fade into desperation, and I've learned to recognize the signs that most people miss. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the case of Marcus Whitfield and his 3 missing wives. It started on a humid Tuesday morning in September when I got the call about Rebecca Whitfield. She was 28, a kindergarten teacher with bright eyes and an infectious laugh, according to her sister who filed the report. Rebecca had been married to Marcus for just 8 months when she vanished without a trace from their suburban home in Millbrook Heights. She would never just leave, Rebecca's sister Amanda insisted as she sat across from my desk, tissues clutched in her trembling hands. She was planning our mother's birthday party. She had lesson plans prepared for the next 2 weeks. Rebecca doesn't even go to the grocery store without making a list and telling someone where she's going. I've heard these words 1,000 times before. Family members always insist their loved ones would never just disappear. But something about Amanda's certainty made me pay closer attention. Maybe it was the way she described Rebecca's meticulous nature. Or maybe it was the fear I saw flickering in her eyes when she mentioned Marcus. Marcus Whitfield was everything you'd expect from a man who worked in pharmaceutical sales. Charming, well-dressed, articulate. When I first met him at his home, a pristine 2-story colonial with a manicured lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine, he seemed like the picture of a concerned husband. "Detective, I appreciate you taking this seriously," he said, offering me coffee from an expensive-looking machine. "I know statistics suggest that when a spouse goes missing, the husband is usually involved somehow. But I love Rebecca more than life itself. I just want her to come home safely." His performance was flawless. The right amount of worry creasing his brow, the slight tremor in his voice when he said her name, the way he kept glancing at their wedding photo on the mantel. If I hadn't been trained to look beneath the surface, I might have bought it completely. But there were tiny inconsistencies. The way he described Rebecca's morning routine didn't match what Amanda had told me. He claimed Rebecca had been acting strange lately, withdrawn and secretive, but her co-workers and friends painted a picture of someone who had been happier than ever. Most telling of all was his immediate suggestion that maybe Rebecca had run off with someone else. "I hate to even think it," he said, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, "but she'd been getting text messages at odd hours. When I asked about them, she'd just say it was work stuff, but kindergarten teachers don't usually get urgent messages at midnight, you know? It was too neat, too convenient. In my experience, innocent spouses don't immediately start building alternative theories about affairs or secret lives. They're usually in complete denial that anything bad could have happened at all." I started digging deeper into Marcus Whitfield's background, and that's when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't his first missing wife. It wasn't even his second. Marcus had been married twice before. His first wife, Jennifer, had disappeared 3 years earlier after only 6 months of marriage. His second wife, Maria, had vanished just 14 months ago, barely a year into their relationship. Both cases had been investigated by different departments in different counties. Both had eventually gone cold. 3 wives. 3 disappearances. 3 cases that somehow never got connected because Marcus was smart enough to move around, to restart his life in a new town each time, to reinvent himself as the grieving widower who deserved a fresh start. I requested the files on Jennifer and Maria immediately, my hands shaking as I made the calls. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than anything I'd encountered in over a decade of police work. How had no one noticed? How had this man been allowed to marry again and again, each time with his previous wives simply gone? As I waited for those files to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something much bigger and more sinister than a single missing person case. The truly terrifying part wasn't just that Marcus had made 3 wives disappear. It was how good he was at it. How he'd managed to fool investigators, families, and entire communities into believing he was nothing more than an unlucky man who kept losing the women he loved. But I was about to discover that Marcus Whitfield's luck was finally running out. The files arrived on Thursday morning and I spread them across my desk like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Jennifer Morrison, 26, a nurse from Cedar Falls. Maria Santos, 31, a graphic designer from Riverside County. And now Rebecca Chen. Yes, we shared the same last name though no relation. Kindergarten teacher from Millbrook Heights. 3 different women, 3 different professions, 3 different counties. But as I read through the case notes, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Each woman had disappeared within their first year of marriage. Each had been described by Marcus as becoming distant and secretive in the weeks before vanishing. Each had supposedly left behind their purse, keys and phone, the holy trinity of items no woman abandons voluntarily. I called Detective Mike Rodriguez, who had handled Jennifer's case in Cedar Falls. His voice carried the weariness of too many unsolved cases when I explained why I was calling. Marcus Whitfield, he repeated slowly. Yeah, I remember him. Seemed genuinely broken up about his wife's disappearance. We investigated him thoroughly, checked his alibi, searched the house, analyzed his financials. Nothing. Guy was clean as a whistle. What about the circumstances of Jennifer's disappearance? I asked, already knowing what he'd tell me. Textbook runaway wife scenario, or so it seemed. She'd apparently been having problems at work, some conflict with her supervisor. Marcus said she'd been talking about wanting to start fresh somewhere new. Her car was found at the bus station with her purse inside, like she'd decided to just go. The same story. Different details, but the same underlying narrative Marcus had crafted. A troubled wife who chose to disappear rather than face her problems. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Detective Lisa Park from Maria Santos' case told me something that made my blood pressure spike. The strangest thing was how quickly Marcus seemed to move on, she said. I mean, I get that people grieve differently, but 3 months after Maria disappeared he was already putting the house on the market and talking about relocating for work. Said he couldn't bear to stay where they'd been happy together. 3 months. Rebecca had been missing for 2 weeks, and Marcus had already mentioned to Amanda that he might need to get away from all the memories soon. But it was when I started digging into Marcus's financial records that the pattern became truly sinister. Each wife had come into the marriage with significant assets. Jennifer had inherited $180,000 from her grandmother just 6 months before meeting Marcus. Maria had a successful freelance business and substantial savings. Rebecca had received a settlement from a car accident the year before. Nearly $250,000. Within weeks of each marriage, Marcus had convinced his wives to consolidate their finances, to add his name to their accounts for convenience. In each case, mysterious expenses had begun appearing shortly before the disappearances. Large cash withdrawals, payments to shell companies that didn't seem to exist, transfers to accounts that led nowhere. I was staring at the financial motive, but there was something else. Something darker that I couldn't quite put my finger yet. This wasn't just about money. The pattern was too specific, too ritualistic. Marcus wasn't just stealing from these women, he was collecting them somehow. I decided to visit Jennifer's family, even though it meant a 4-hour drive to Cedar Falls. Her mother, Patricia Morrison, invited me into a living room that felt like a shrine to her missing daughter. Jennifer's photographs covered every surface, frozen moments of a life cut short. She called me 2 days before she disappeared, Patricia told me, her voice barely above a whisper. She sounded scared. She said Marcus had been asking strange questions about her family, about her childhood. She thought he might be planning some kind of surprise, but something in his behavior was making her uncomfortable. What kind of questions? About her father. Jennifer's dad died when she was 12. Marcus wanted to know everything: how he died, where he was buried, what kind of man he was. Jennifer thought it was sweet at first, like he was trying to understand her better. But then he started asking about other men in her life. Ex-boyfriends, male friends, even her male cousins. It was like he was cataloging them or something. A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard similar stories from Maria's friends. Marcus's intense interest in the men who had been important to her. Even Amanda had mentioned that Marcus had peppered Rebecca with questions about her past relationships during their brief marriage. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the 3 case files, trying to understand what I was really looking at. This wasn't just a serial killer who targeted wives for their money. This was something more complex, more psychologically twisted. Marcus Whitfield was collecting these women, studying them, learning everything about their lives and relationships. But why? What was he doing with them once they disappeared? And how was he making them vanish so completely that trained investigators couldn't find a single trace? I was about to find out that the truth was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. Because Marcus Whitfield wasn't just making his wives disappear. He was keeping them. All of them. And Rebecca was still alive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus himself. Because killers, no matter how careful they think they are, always make mistakes. And Marcus Whitfield was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. It was Rebecca's credit card that cracked the case wide open. I'd been monitoring all financial activity on the accounts she shared with Marcus, hoping for any sign of movement. Most killers are smart enough to avoid using their victims' cards, but Marcus had been careful for so long that I think he'd grown overconfident. The charge appeared on a Friday afternoon, $247.83 at Henderson's Hardware and Garden Center, 2 towns over from Millbrook Heights. It was such a small amount, almost insignificant, but it was activity on an account that should have been dormant. I drove to Henderson's immediately. The manager, a weathered man named Phil Henderson, pulled up the transaction on his computer. "Yeah, I remember this sale," he said, squinting at the screen. "Guy bought some unusual stuff. Heavy-duty storage containers, industrial-grade locks, soundproofing foam, and about 50 feet of chain. Paid with a card, but I remember thinking it was weird he had the woman's name on it." "Did he say what it was for?" "Home renovation project," he said. "Mentioned something about converting a basement into a workshop. Seemed normal enough except..." Phil paused, his face troubled. "Except he kept looking around like he was worried someone might see him. And when I asked if he needed help loading everything, he got real defensive. Said he could handle it himself." My heart was pounding as I left Henderson's. Storage containers, chains, soundproofing materials. This wasn't about hiding bodies. This was about keeping people alive. Marcus wasn't just a killer. He was keeping his wives imprisoned somewhere. I obtained a warrant to search Marcus's current property, but I already knew we wouldn't find anything there. He was too smart for that. Instead, I started digging into every property he'd owned or rented in the past 5 years. Real estate records, utility bills, storage unit rentals, anything that might give me a clue about where he was keeping his victims. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, his pharmaceutical sales job. Marcus worked for Henderson Pharmaceuticals. Yes, the same Henderson family that owned the hardware store. It wasn't a coincidence that he'd shopped there. He probably knew he could trust their discretion. But more importantly, his employment records showed he had access to medical supplies, including sedatives and pain medications. I started calling every property management company in a 50-mile radius, asking about rentals under Marcus's name or his business. On the 4th call, I hit gold. Sunset Storage Solutions had rented him a climate-controlled unit 18 months ago, right around the time Maria Santos disappeared. Unit 47B, the manager told me over the phone. He paid for 2 years upfront, cash. Said he needed it for business inventory. Real quiet tenant, never any problems. But when I asked about the unit's specifications, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just storage. It was one of their premium units, originally designed as a workshop space. It had electricity, running water, and most importantly, it was soundproof for clients who needed to work with loud equipment. I assembled a tactical team and we hit the storage facility at dawn. I'll never forget the sound of those bolt cutters breaking through the chains on Unit 47B, or the smell that hit us when we rolled up that metal door. The unit had been converted into something that belonged in a horror movie. The space was divided into 3 sections, each one a miniature prison cell with reinforced walls and heavy locks. Medical equipment lined one wall. IVs, monitors, enough pharmaceutical supplies to run a small clinic. And in the back corner, a desk with 3 thick folders, each labeled with a woman's name. But it was what we found in those cells that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Jennifer Morrison was in the first cell, alive but barely recognizable. 3 years of captivity had taken their toll, but she was conscious and aware. Maria Santos was in the second cell, in similar condition but showing signs of more recent psychological trauma. And in the third cell we found Rebecca. She was weak, sedated but alive. All 3 women were alive. Marcus had been keeping them prisoner, drugging them to keep them compliant, using his medical knowledge to keep them healthy enough to survive but too weak to escape. The folders on his desk contained detailed records of their captivity, what he fed them, how much medication he gave them, even psychological notes about their behavior and responses to different treatments. But the most disturbing part was what else we found in those files. Marcus had been documenting everything about these women's lives before their marriages. Their relationships, their family histories, their fears and dreams. He'd been studying them like specimens, and his notes revealed a mind that was completely detached from any sense of human empathy. Subject: Jennifer responds well to isolation therapy. One entry read. Mentions of father figure increase compliance. Note: explore daddy issues further in future acquisitions. He was treating them like experiments, like objects to be studied and controlled. This wasn't about money, though he'd certainly stolen plenty from each of them. This was about power, about the ultimate control over another human being. As the paramedics worked to stabilize the three women, I found myself shaking with rage and horror. How had we missed this? How had Marcus managed to keep 3 people imprisoned for years without anyone suspecting? The answer was simple and terrifying. Because he was patient, methodical, and completely without conscience. He'd chosen victims who were isolated, who wouldn't be missed immediately. He'd cultivated the perfect image of a grieving husband, moving to new towns, starting fresh with new identities and new victims. But there was still one question that kept gnawing at me as I watched those brave women being loaded into ambulances. Where was Marcus? His car wasn't at his house, and according to his work, he'd called in sick that morning. He was gone, and I had a horrible feeling that he already knew we'd found his storage unit. The hunt for Marcus Whitfield was just beginning, and I was about to discover that catching a monster isn't the same as stopping one. Marcus Whitfield had vanished like smoke, but unlike his wives, he'd left a trail. Credit card transactions heading north toward the Canadian border, security footage from gas stations showing a man matching his description, cell phone pings that created a digital breadcrumb path of his escape route. But I wasn't interested in chasing him down the highway. I was more concerned with understanding him, because I had a terrible feeling that we'd only discovered part of his operation. 3 wives, 1 storage unit. It felt too neat, too contained for someone who'd been perfecting his system for years. I spent the next 48 hours going through every document we'd seized from Unit 47B. Marcus had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and what I found in those files painted a picture of a man who was far more dangerous than we'd initially realized. The psychological profiles he'd created for each victim were disturbingly detailed. He'd documented their trigger words, their deepest fears, their emotional weak points. For Jennifer, it was her father's death and her fear of abandonment. For Maria, it was her struggle with self-worth and her desperate need for approval. For Rebecca, it was her anxiety about not being good enough, her perfectionist tendencies that made her easy to manipulate. Marcus had weaponized their vulnerabilities, using their own psychology against them to maintain control. But more disturbing was how he'd used this information to select them in the first place. Each woman had been carefully chosen not just for their financial assets, but for their specific psychological profiles. He's a collector, Dr. Amanda Foster, the FBI's behavioral analyst assigned to the case, explained as we reviewed the files together. But he's not collecting objects, he's collecting experiences. Each woman represents a different type of control fantasy. Jennifer, the nurturing caregiver he could reduce to helplessness. Maria, the independent artist he could break down and rebuild. Rebecca, the perfectionist he could slowly drive to obsession with pleasing him. So this isn't about money at all? The money is just a bonus. This is about psychological domination. Look at these notes. He's documenting their psychological deterioration like it's a scientific experiment. He's studying how to break human beings down to their most basic components. As we continued analyzing Marcus's records, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. His interest in his victims' past relationships wasn't random. He'd been using that information to torment them. The files contained detailed plans for psychological manipulation, including staged coincidences, where he'd mention specific details about their ex-boyfriends or family members, making them think he'd somehow encountered these people. But the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Future Acquisitions. Inside were preliminary profiles of 12 other women, complete with photographs, background information, and psychological assessments. Marcus hadn't just been planning to keep his current victims, he'd been preparing to expand his collection. Among those potential victims was a name that made my blood freeze: Detective Sarah Chen. My own photograph stared back at me from one of those files, along with notes about my work schedule, my apartment building, and my lone wolf tendencies that would make me an interesting challenge. Marcus had been planning to come after me. The hunter had been planning to become the hunted. Dr. Foster looked grim as she reviewed my file. He's been watching you since you started investigating Rebecca's disappearance. Look at this timeline. He's documented your movements, your investigation methods, even your coffee preferences. He was preparing to study you just like he studied the others. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been trying to understand Marcus, he'd been studying me. Every interview, every conversation, every moment I'd spent in his presence, he'd been gathering information to use against me later. Why didn't he just run when he realized I was getting close? I asked. Because you'd become part of his collection. In his mind, you're not just an investigator. You're a new acquisition. Look at these notes about your fascinating psychological profile and your unique combination of vulnerability and strength. He sees you as the ultimate challenge. That's when I understood the real horror of what we were dealing with. Marcus wasn't just a serial killer or even a kidnapper. He was a psychological predator who viewed other human beings as objects to be collected, studied, and controlled. And he was still out there, still planning, still hunting. The manhunt intensified, but I knew we weren't just racing against time. We were racing against Marcus's next move. Because men like him don't just disappear. They adapt, they evolve, and they continue hunting. 3 days after discovering the storage unit, I got a call that confirmed my worst fears. A woman named Lisa Parker had disappeared from a small town just over the Canadian border. She was 29, a social worker, recently divorced, and she'd been seen having coffee with a charming man who'd claimed to be a pharmaceutical sales consultant visiting the area. The description matched Marcus Whitfield perfectly. He hadn't fled to hide, he'd fled to hunt. And he was already selecting his next victim. But this time I had something he didn't expect. I had his playbook, his methods, and most importantly, I knew exactly how his mind worked. The student was about to become the teacher, and Marcus Whitfield was about to learn that some people fight back. The final confrontation was coming, and I was going to make sure that this time, the monster didn't get away. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been sleeping fitfully, plagued by nightmares about storage units and psychological profiles, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Detective Chen, the familiar voice said, and my blood turned to ice. It was Marcus Whitfield. I've been hoping we could talk. I fumbled for the recording app on my phone while trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus. Where are you? Close enough. I've been following your investigation with great interest. Very thorough work, Detective. I'm impressed by how quickly you connected the dots that other investigators missed for years. Where's Lisa Parker? I demanded, but he chuckled softly. Safe. For now. But I'm not calling about Lisa. I'm calling about you, Sarah. May I call you Sarah? I feel like we know each other so well by now. The way he said my name made my skin crawl. What do you want, Marcus? I want to meet. Just you and me. No backup, no tactical teams, no recording devices. I have something that belongs to you and I think you'll want it back. I don't know what you're talking about. Your sister's wedding ring. The world stopped. My sister Emily had died in a car accident 2 years ago. Her wedding ring had been buried with her, according to the funeral director. But somehow, impossibly, Marcus had it. You're lying, I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew he wasn't. Marcus didn't lie about his trophies. Millbrook Cemetery, Section C, Plot 47. Your sister's grave was surprisingly easy to access, Sarah. Security cameras are useless when you know exactly when the guards change shifts. The ring is quite beautiful. White gold with those tiny diamonds she loved so much. She's wearing it in all the photos on your refrigerator. I was going to be sick. Marcus had desecrated my sister's grave, stolen her wedding ring, all to manipulate me into meeting him. The psychological profile in his files made perfect sense now. He'd identified my deepest wound and weaponized it against me. Meet me at the old Riverside Mill at midnight tomorrow, he continued. Come alone or the ring goes into the river along with Lisa Parker. And Sarah? I know you well enough to know you're recording this call. It won't matter. You'll come anyway because you can't stand the thought of me keeping something that belongs to Emily. The line went dead. I sat in my dark apartment, trembling with rage and grief. Marcus had violated the one sacred thing in my life, my sister's memory. But he'd also made a crucial mistake. He thought he understood me, thought he could predict my behavior based on his psychological profiles. What he didn't realize was that studying someone's vulnerabilities doesn't mean you understand their strengths. I called Dr. Foster immediately. He wants to meet, I told her. And I'm going to do it. Sarah, you can't. It's obviously a trap. He's trying to add you to his collection. Maybe. But he's also giving us our only chance to catch him. Lisa Parker is still alive and she'll die if we don't find her soon. Plus, he has something of mine that I need back. I spent the next 18 hours preparing for what I knew would be the most dangerous encounter of my career. The Riverside Mill was an abandoned textile factory about 20 miles outside town, perfect for Marcus's purposes. Isolated, multiple exit routes and plenty of places to hide additional victims or supplies. But I wasn't going in blind. Using thermal imaging from a police helicopter, we identified 3 heat signatures inside the building. Marcus, Lisa Parker, and a third person who was probably either another victim or an accomplice. I went in wearing a wire and a GPS tracker with a SWAT team positioned around the perimeter. The mill was a maze of rusted machinery and broken windows. I found Marcus waiting for me in what had once been the main production floor, standing calmly beside a chair where Lisa Parker sat bound and gagged. She was alive but clearly drugged, her eyes unfocused and frightened. Punctual as always, Marcus said, smiling that charming smile that had fooled so many people. I've always admired that about you, Sarah. So reliable, so predictable. He was holding Emily's ring, turning it over in his fingers like a worry stone. The sight of it made me want to put a bullet in his head, but I needed him alive. Lisa needed him alive. Let her go, Marcus. This is between you and me. Oh, but it's not just between us anymore. You see, Sarah, you've disrupted my work. 3 years of careful planning, 3 perfect acquisitions, all ruined because you couldn't leave well enough alone. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to find subjects with the right psychological profiles? They're not subjects, Marcus. They're human beings. They have families, lives, people who love them. Love. He said the word like it was something distasteful. Love is just chemical reactions and evolutionary programming. What I do is pure. It's about understanding the true nature of human psychology, about exploring the limits of mental and emotional endurance. My subjects help advance the science of human behavior. I'd heard enough. You're not a scientist, Marcus. You're a sick man who gets off on torturing women. There's nothing noble or scientific about what you do. His mask slipped for just a moment and I saw the rage underneath. You don't understand the importance of my work. But you will. You're going to be my masterpiece, Sarah. The detective who thought she could outsmart me, reduced to the same broken state as all the others. That's when I realized the truth that would haunt me forever. Marcus hadn't chosen me as his next victim because I was investigating him. He'd orchestrated Rebecca's disappearance specifically to draw me in. He'd been planning this confrontation from the beginning, using Rebecca and the others as bait to lure the one subject he really wanted, me. You killed Rebecca's husband, didn't you? I said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking together. The real Marcus Whitfield died 3 years ago and you took his identity. His smile widened. Very good, detective. Though killed is such a crude word. I prefer to think of it as career advancement. The real Marcus was a pharmaceutical sales rep with the perfect cover story and no close family to ask questions. I simply became him. Who are you really? Does it matter? Names are just labels, Sarah. What matters is the work. And you're going to help me take it to the next level. He pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid, probably the same sedative he'd used on his other victims. But he'd underestimated me one final time. While he'd been talking, I'd been slowly working the small knife I'd hidden in my boot free from its sheath. The problem with studying people's psychological profiles, I said, palming the knife, is that you sometimes miss the most important thing about them. And what's that? You miss finding out what happens when they fight back. I lunged forward, driving the knife toward his chest, but Marcus was faster than I'd expected. He dodged and swung the syringe toward my neck. We grappled, crashing into the rusted machinery, both of us fighting for control of the deadly needle. The SWAT team came through the windows like thunder, but Marcus had one last surprise. The third heat signature wasn't another victim. It was a dead man switch connected to explosive charges throughout the building. Marcus had been prepared to bring the entire mill down rather than be captured. In the end, it was Lisa Parker who saved us all. Despite being drugged and bound, she managed to kick over a lantern that Marcus had been using for light. In the chaos that followed, with flames spreading across the old wooden floor, Marcus made a desperate grab for Emily's ring, which had fallen during our struggle. That moment of greed cost him everything. As he reached for the ring, I put 2 bullets in his chest. He fell backward into the flames, Emily's ring clutched in his dying hand. We got Lisa out safely along with Emily's ring, which I pried from Marcus's dead fingers. The mill burned to the ground, taking with it all of Marcus's research, his psychological profiles, and his plans for future victims. But the real victory wasn't stopping Marcus Whitfield. It was seeing Jennifer, Maria, and Rebecca slowly rebuilding their lives, supported by their families and by each other. They'd survived something that should have destroyed them, and they were choosing to live instead of just exist. As for me, I keep Emily's ring on my desk now, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about Marcus's files and wonder how many other monsters are out there, studying us, cataloging our weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But I also remember that monsters can be stopped. They can be caught, defeated, and destroyed. It just takes someone willing to look past their perfect facades and see the horror beneath. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and I hunt monsters. And monsters should know that sometimes their prey hunts back.